Okay, in this section, let's talk a little bit about objections. Dealing with objections, by far, in my view, is the weakest area for most students. We might be genetically and possibly culturally predisposed to avoiding uncomfortable objections to our own views, and yet, if we want to progress towards truth, or find out if there is a truth in the first place, we need to courageously beat down these instincts and strive to consider objections in the best possible light. Only by doing that can we really assure ourselves that our views are sufficiently justified. So, know your opponent. I often say this, your paper is only as good as the best argument you defeat. In order to defeat these arguments, though, you need to know who you're arguing against. So if there are authors that we've read that that have opinions different from yours and have reasons for those opinions, you need to identify them. Now, I'm not going to hold you responsible for people we haven't read, but at least for the people we have read, if there's someone out there that we've read and who is likely to disagree with you, it seems to me that not bringing him up might be a bit of a problem. You want to assume a skeptical audience, right? Your reader is not your mom. Your reader is not your friend. Your reader is somebody who is not predisposed towards believing you. Your reader is somebody who's fairly disinterested and just wants to know the truth, right? So you want to assume that your reader is fairly intelligent, fairly well informed, but doesn't know anything about the particular topic that you're addressing, and you want to make it as clear as possible to that reader that your view is correct and that other views are mistaken. So assume a skeptical audience. Anticipate challenges to all your points. This requires a little bit of mental acrobatics, but you need to be able to think about what other people will say in response to what you're saying, right? So you need to put yourself in their shoes and say, okay, if I were to hold these other views, what would I say? This is really part of becoming a subtle, good, argumentative thinker, because this will persuade your audience, your skeptical audience, that you have in fact anticipated what the other side is going to say, that you are in fact you have full knowledge of all the relevant facts. It's not that you're just ignoring some part of the argument, but that you have in fact understood the argument and you have reasons for choosing one side. You want to state these challenges clearly and charitably. So you don't want to attribute straw man type views to other authors. You want to deal with them on their strongest possible terms, not their weakest. No one's very impressed if you defeat an easy, obvious problem. I'm sorry, not an obvious problem, but a obviously flawed objection. So you want to state the objection with as much nuance, again, with as much charity as you possibly can, and that's the argument you need to defeat. And of course, how do you deal with those challenges? How do you rebut these objections? Well, you appeal to evidence, you appeal to non-controversial definitions, and you try to appeal to principles you think that you are likely to share with your reader. Not necessarily with your opponent, but certainly with your skeptical audience. So try to be the reasonable voice in the room, and if you can do that, then chances are you will produce the better argument. Let me give you some tips for coming up with objections, because students sometimes tell me, I can't possibly think of what someone else would say against me. I cannot possibly imagine why somebody would disagree with me. So here's some things to consider. One, there's almost always a contrast between consequentialists and partisans of deontology. So if someone is making an argument based on all the good consequences that would bring, think about what respect for persons would require. Generally speaking, there's going to be some kind of action there. And the opposite is equally true. If you're making an argument about what the best thing to do to respect persons is, then you're going to have to anticipate possible objections from people who are going to say, but that's going to lead to all kinds of bad consequences. And so you want to say, well, maybe it won't lead to those bad consequences, or here's why consequences don't matter in this particular instance. A second thing you can do to come up with possible objections to your view is to think outside your culture, religion, or country. Think to yourself, does everybody think this way? Are there people out there with fundamentally different assumptions than me? And what do they say? And why do they say what they say? Right? Engage with alternative perspectives, and think a little bit outside your ordinary comfort zone. And what this will do is will convince your reader that you have really considered alternatives. A third thing to think about is, are you having a disagreement about the facts? Right? It's possible that in certain debates, the real disagreement is not one of principles. You share really principles, but it's one about what the facts are. Some people believe the facts as they stand point one way, some people point the other way. If that's the case, then that's the easiest paper to write, because all you have to do is go to a literature review, find out what scholars have said about the issue, and report that. And once you've done that, your paper has written itself, because the only disagreement is one of facts. Now, I don't know that I ever assign papers where facts are the only thing that are at issue, but they certainly can be also one of the things at issue. And so you want to consider carefully whether there are any big disputes about the facts, right? So think about, the big isms. Does socialism tend to impede economic development or growth? Does capitalism speed up economic development or growth? Is capitalism good or bad for the working classes? Is socialism good or bad for the working classes? Is socialism good or bad for innovation? So when you're thinking about issues between capitalism and socialism, you have a whole lot of empirical, factual issues to settle. Now, of course, not all questions are empirical questions, but sometimes it's just about the values. But when there are empirical questions, you should probably think about addressing them. And of course, if it's not a question of empirical evidence, then it's a question of values. And so there might be a question about which facts are relevant. Different values will point to different facts. And so people will place different emphasis on different values, and so let me give you an example of this. Maybe that'll make it clearer. Recently, there have been gun control debates in the United States, and different people will bring up different statistics about homicides and gun violence, and the ownership of guns, and the rules governing the ownership of guns. And one of the things that seems to be the case is that there's the debate about whether to include suicides as one of the statistics that should count when you're thinking about gun violence. And of course, there's some people who say, well, what we're really worried about is other regarding crime, that is to say, crimes that hurt other people. And others want to say, no, we should count either as other regarding crime or as a crime in itself, suicide, as kind of one of the negative potential social outcomes that is associated with higher rates of gun ownership. And so, again, this is a question not about what the facts are, but about which facts are relevant, and whether, in this case, suicide is a relevant component of this debate. Okay. All right, so what are some of the things to avoid when thinking about objections? Well, this is something that students sometimes do, and I give them some partial credit for doing it, but it's still a problem, which is that they bring up objections. So they bring up a devastating or plausible objection to their own view, and then they just let it go. They just move on. They don't actually rebut the objection, right? So you have to engage with the objection. You can't just bring it up and let it drop. You have to actually deal with it. That's more difficult, of course, but that's the essence of being persuasive. Another thing you can avoid, you want to try to avoid when you're dealing with with several reasonable but competing views, is sinking into relativism, right? It's true that some questions have no answer or have no clear answer, but we don't get answers to any questions by assuming that there are no answers to be found at the beginning of the investigation, right? That's something we can only conclude at the end of our investigation. Let common sense morality guide you, rather than a sense of, well, this is all complicated and we just throw up our hands. And we want to make a good faith effort, a good sincere faith effort to answer the question. Try not to immediately sink into relativism on the subject, and try to really answer the question. Straw men or uncharitable readings. I've already talked about this a little bit, but again, try to avoid caricatures of opposing arguments. Address the real arguments that others are making, not the obvious, easy to rebut arguments that they're making. So, try to be charitable. Okay. Up next, I'm going to discuss a whole smorgasbord of different common problems with student essays.